I want to tell you about a brewery that doesn't exist anymore, the building torn down, the equipment long gone, and about the 45 days it took me to make that happen without ever touching a single piece of machinery I wasn't supposed to touch. Years ago I brewed at a brewpub for an owner who was, honestly, a complete lunatic, the kind of boss who thought loyalty only ever flowed in one direction. I tolerated a lot from that man for over a year. Then my mother died, and he asked me to come in and work a shift right after her funeral, and something in me that had been patient for a very long time simply stopped being patient. Let me back up and explain the actual job first, because the setup matters more than it might seem at first. Before he ever hired me, the owner had bought used brewery equipment from a shut-down microbrewery, and it was a mess of mismatched choices from the start, a system roughly 4 times bigger than the place actually needed, running alongside cheap mass-market beers he also insisted on selling. I made it work anyway. I even got a genuinely difficult, finicky house yeast strain behaving properly, something that takes real time and attention to get right, the kind of thing you can't just replace overnight if it goes wrong. But because the brewery itself only needed brewing maybe 3 or 4 times a month, I wasn't anywhere close to needing a full 40-hour week, even though I was salaried. So the owner decided the fix was to have me cover night manager shifts a couple nights a week just to fill out my hours on paper. Fine. Annoying, but fine. I did that for over a year without much complaint, because most of the time it really was an easy enough gig, and I liked the actual brewing part of the job enough to put up with the rest of it. There's something genuinely satisfying about getting a stubborn yeast strain to behave, about tasting a batch 3 weeks in and knowing exactly what it's going to become. That part of the work I never resented. It was everything wrapped around it, the mismatched equipment, the cut corners, the way he treated every request from me like a personal favor he was doing me, that slowly wore me down over that year. Then my mother passed away, and everything about how I saw that job changed within about a week. I want to be honest, I wasn't thinking about work at all in those first few days. I was thinking about my dad, who wasn't handling any of it well, and about logistics, about family flying in, about all the small, exhausting tasks that come with losing someone, tasks nobody warns you about until you're the one doing them at 2 in the morning. There was a memorial service planned for a Thursday and the burial for the family the following Friday. I planned ahead responsibly, the way I planned everything at that job, made sure the tanks were stocked and covered so the brewery genuinely wouldn't need me for at least a week, so nobody could say I'd left them stranded. I thought I'd handled it. Then, the Wednesday before, my boss came to me and said he needed me to work the night shift both Thursday and Friday, the exact 2 days of my mother's memorial and burial, to make up for time I'd already taken off to help my dad, who wasn't handling any of this well either. He wanted me back at work the same day as the funeral. I refused, flatly, no negotiation in my voice at all. He told me fine, but then I'd be working a double shift that Saturday instead, like this was some kind of fair trade he was offering me, like grief had a schedule that could just be rearranged around his staffing needs if I was willing to be reasonable about it. I nearly lost it standing right there in front of him. I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back, pulled off somewhere outside, and then went back in and told him something had changed permanently. I was done with the manager's shifts entirely. From now on I'd be hourly, brewery work only, nothing else. He went red in the face and told me I was being dramatic about a scheduling issue. He was furious, but he was also stuck, because he needed someone who could actually run that equipment, and that someone was me. Nobody else on staff had spent a year learning how to coax that particular yeast strain into behaving, or knew the quirks of a system that was built for a brewery 4 times the size of ours. He could be furious all he wanted. He couldn't replace what he didn't understand in the first place. A few weeks after that conversation, I started noticing my paychecks looked smaller than they should have. I hadn't been tracking my punches closely before, mostly because I'd only ever clocked in and out to handle manager tasks, but I still had leftover access to the scheduling system from that role, and when I finally sat down and checked it against my own notes, I found out he'd been quietly altering my hours for weeks, shaving time off here and there, cheating me out of roughly 20 hours across just 6 weeks. I sat with those numbers for a long time before I did anything about it, going back through old pay stubs, cross-referencing dates against my own handwritten notes, making absolutely sure I wasn't imagining a pattern that wasn't really there. It was there. 20 hours. hours, gone, quietly shaved off week after week from a man who'd made me work a double shift the same month I buried my mother. That was the moment I stopped being someone who was simply annoyed with this man and became someone with a plan. Here's what most people don't know about brewing, and it's the entire reason this worked. When you finish fermenting a batch, you harvest the yeast out of it to reuse for the next one, especially with a house strain you've spent real time cultivating, because it's not something you can just buy an exact replacement for at the store. But that harvested yeast only stays usable for about 30 days before it turns sour and starts dying off completely. I had just harvested yeast from our last batch, the good stuff, the strain I'd spent actual effort getting right. Normally I'd have taken specific steps to keep it healthy in storage. This time, I didn't. I just let it sit in the cold room and did nothing. I stopped going in more than I absolutely had to, just enough to log tank levels so nothing looked obviously wrong from a distance, and I even sent him a message at one point claiming I'd brewed a new batch when I hadn't touched a single tank. Then I waited, and honestly, the waiting was its own strange kind of work. I still showed up. I still smiled at customers when I had to. I still made small talk with him about ordering more grain we both knew I had no intention of actually using. Every single day that passed was a day closer to that yeast being permanently unusable, and every single day I said nothing about it at all. On day 45, well past the point where that yeast had any chance of being usable, right after my final paycheck cleared, I overnight my keys back to him along with a resignation letter and nothing else. He called me the next day screaming into the phone. I told him I knew exactly what he'd done with my hours, and that I wasn't coming back, and I hung up before he could say anything else. I never actually saw what he found when he finally went down into that cellar, but I've thought about it plenty, more than is probably healthy, if I'm being honest with you. Empty fermenters, standing dry for the first time in years. Nearly empty serving tanks, the taps producing nothing but air. A batch of dead, unusable yeast, the one thing in that entire building he actually needed and had no idea how to replace. Almost no grain left to even start over properly. Just silence, and a business that had been quietly running on fumes for weeks without him having any idea, because the one person who understood what those numbers actually meant had already mailed back his keys. I heard secondhand that the brewery stopped producing anything at all not long after that. About a year later, staff apparently showed up one morning to padlocked doors and no explanation, no final paycheck conversation, nothing, the same way he'd once treated my own hours like they were his to quietly rewrite. I drove past that same spot years afterward out of curiosity, and the building wasn't just closed anymore, it had been completely torn down, like the whole place had simply been erased. When I finally told this story on Reddit's pro-revenge community, it resonated with a lot of people who'd clearly worked service or trade jobs themselves, people who understood exactly what it means to be the one irreplaceable person in a building that refuses to admit you're irreplaceable until the day you stop showing up. One comment in particular stuck with me more than any other, from someone who described themselves as a serious home brewer. They explained that losing a cultivated house yeast strain isn't something you can just casually undo, that sure, you can buy more yeast off the shelf, that part's cheap and easy, but if you've spent real time building a specific strain into something unique to your beer, it never comes back the same way once it's gone. Reading that confirmed something I already suspected but hadn't fully understood technically, that I hadn't just cost him a batch or two. I'd taken something from that business that no amount of money could simply replace, something built out of a year of my own attention that he'd never once acknowledged was worth anything at all until it was already gone. What I keep sitting with is how quiet the entire thing actually was. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do, because it still matters to me. I never sabotaged a single valve or dumped a single tank. I never lied about anything except one small message claiming I'd done work I hadn't. I just stopped doing the one specific, skilled thing that only I knew how to do properly, at the exact moment it mattered most, and let nature and neglect finish the rest on their own schedule. So I'll leave you with this. If the only thing standing between a business and total collapse is one underpaid, disrespected employee quietly doing their job correctly, was it ever really that employee's responsibility to keep holding it up in the first place? I've never regretted the answer I landed on, but I'm curious whether you'd have landed somewhere different.